I used to think the most dangerous things in freight were snowstorms, refrigeration failures, or a driver falling asleep on a long haul. I was wrong. Sometimes the thing that destroys a company in a matter of days is not weather or bad luck, but the arrogance of people who have never touched the real work. They fired me, handed a mission-critical system to an unproven platform dressed up in buzzwords, and only after millions were lost. Drivers were stranded, and federal regulators started looking their way. Did they call me back and beg for help? But I did not return to reclaim my old seat. I returned to set the terms. My name is Claire Donovan, and I have never thought of my job as some polished title meant to impress people on a business card. Officially, I was the Senior Logistics Systems Manager at Sterling Freight Systems in Memphis. In reality, I was the woman responsible for making sure hundreds of trucks on the road knew exactly where to go, what they were hauling, which route they could legally take, where they had to stop, what they had to avoid, and how to deliver every load without destroying the company's margins along the way. Our fleet moved across a wide stretch of states, and the cargo was never simple. Some trailers carried frozen food. Some carried temperature-sensitive pharmaceuticals. Some hauled regulated materials that could not legally travel through certain tunnels, over certain bridges, or near specific facilities. One bad decision could cost far more than money. It could damage contracts, trigger penalties, stain the company's safety record, and put real people's livelihoods at risk. I had lived inside that pressure for more than a decade, long enough to understand that logistics is not just dots moving across a digital map. Behind every GPS signal is a person gripping a steering wheel, a family waiting on that paycheck, and a client ready to punish even the smallest failure. That is why I never saw our dispatch system as software alone. To me, it was the company's heartbeat. I had spent too many years keeping that heartbeat steady to mistake it for something disposable. Every patch, every workaround, every emergency fix was tied to a memory, a lesson, a close call, or a hard-earned victory. People who looked at the screens saw dashboards and code. I saw years of responsibility. I saw promises made to customers and pressure absorbed by drivers. And I knew exactly how much could collapse if the wrong hands ever treated that system like a toy instead of what it truly was. That morning began with something that sent a chill straight through me: silence. Anyone who has spent real time in this business knows the dispatch channel is never truly quiet. There is always somebody calling in about a late gate check, a blocked route, a refrigeration alert, a fueling problem, a weather shift, or a delivery window that just got tighter. So when I walked in on a Monday morning and realized the usual frequency had gone almost dead, my first feeling was not relief. It was dread. In freight, silence only means one of two things. Either everything is running so perfectly that no one needs help, which is close to fantasy, or the system is in trouble and people cannot reach each other the way they should. I knew which explanation felt more likely. That instinct was not superstition. It came from years of seeing disasters before they fully surfaced. There are small signals in this line of work that outsiders would miss completely. But to someone like me, they are like the smell of smoke before anyone sees flames. A network with hundreds of moving trucks does not suddenly go still because life became easy. It goes still because something has gone wrong enough to break the normal flow of noise. I stood there for a moment, listening to that unnatural emptiness, and felt my mind already racing through the worst possibilities. I hated that feeling, because it usually meant I was about to spend the day catching something ugly before it grew teeth. What exhausted me most was not the thought of fixing it. It was knowing that almost no one else in the building understood the danger in that silence the way I did. They would hear peace. I would hear warning. And in my experience, warning was almost always the truth. People outside freight love to imagine this industry is simple. They think a shipment is just a load on a truck going from one place to another. Every time I hear that, part of me wants to laugh and part of me wants to shake them. What they call on-time delivery is actually the result of thousands of variables being held in balance minute by minute. A run is never just an origin and a destination. It comes with strict delivery windows that trigger painful penalties if missed. Federal hours of service rules that cannot be stretched without consequences. Fuel cost calculations. weather patterns, traffic risks, gate delays, refrigeration thresholds, cargo classifications, and driver-specific realities that do not fit neatly inside a sales presentation. If a refrigerated trailer sits too long in the wrong place, the product can be ruined. If a driver is pushed onto a route that exceeds legal working time, the company can be fined, and its compliance history can take a hit that lasts for years. If hazardous cargo is sent through a restricted route, the problem moves from bad operations into serious legal exposure. I knew these things because I had lived them. I had been the one cleaning up after bad assumptions for years. That is why I had no patience for shiny people who used phrases like the system will optimize itself. Nothing optimizes itself in a world this messy, unless the people behind it understand how ugly reality gets outside the conference room. If you have ever underestimated how much work goes into making something arrive exactly when and where it should, comment number 1 right here. I mean that. Because logistics is one of those invisible systems people only notice when it breaks. And once it breaks, everyone suddenly learns that what looked like a simple delivery was actually a fragile chain held together by human judgment. Memory. An experience far more than most people ever imagine. The system I built was not something you could download, install, and trust by the end of the afternoon. It was a living structure shaped over years by databases, custom integrations, patched code, and constant adaptation to the ugly details of the real world. On paper, plenty of things sound elegant. Out on the road, elegance means nothing if it cannot survive gate delays, weather swings, customer quirks, driver limits, and state-level compliance rules. My system survived because it was bent toward reality instead of trying to force reality into a slide deck. It knew which customers treated 15-minute delays like a criminal offense. It knew which routes had to be avoided when certain categories of freight were involved. It knew where traffic patterns lied to you at certain hours, when fuel savings mattered more than speed, and when the opposite was true. More than that, it carried the way I thought about risk. I did not build it to look smart. I built it to reduce damage, protect commitments, and keep drivers from being pushed into stupid situations by people who never had to live with the consequences. There were nights when I slept badly because my brain was still rearranging logic trees and workarounds for the next morning. After enough years of that, the line between me and the system blurred. Every bug, every patch, every strange exception had become part of my memory. Outsiders saw old code and clunky architecture. I saw the accumulated knowledge of a decade. I saw every season we had survived and every customer complaint we had prevented. The platform was not glamorous, but it was reliable. And in freight, reliability has more value than glamour ever will. There is nothing impressive about software that looks modern and fails under pressure. There is something deeply powerful about a system that knows the world is messy and keeps working anyway. The real unraveling began the day Blackstone Ridge Partners bought the company. I was not naive enough to think a private equity firm would care about the rhythm of dispatch or the stress level of drivers scattered across the country. They looked at a business through spreadsheets and valuation logic. I looked at it through delivery windows, compliance exposure, and the human cost of operational failure. That gap became obvious the moment they sent in their new operations lead, Ethan Cole. Ethan was polished, articulate, sharply dressed, and deeply in love with the sound of his own certainty. He talked about efficiency, restructuring, margin, expansion, and strategic acceleration in the way people do when they want to sound transformational without touching the uncomfortable details underneath. I had met his type before. Strong presentation skills, weak contact with reality. People like that believe if they use enough modern language, they can reinvent any system they do not understand. The day Ethan moved into the office of the previous operations executive, a woman who actually knew the business and had been pushed aside, I felt something inside me tighten. That is always how trouble starts. The people who understand the machinery are treated as outdated, while the people who understand optics step in and take control. Ethan did not come to learn how the business truly functioned. He came to impose a model on it, as if freight could be forced into a cleaner narrative for investors. Watching him speak about the future of the company, like it was a product launch, instead of a living operation, made one thing painfully clear to me: he had no real idea what he was touching. If you have ever watched leadership confuse disruption with competence, give this video a like. Because sometimes the fastest way to damage a company is not competition or bad luck. It is handing power to someone who thinks optimization matters more than understanding why the existing system works. Not long after that, Ethan called me into his office to present what he clearly saw as his big strategic leap forward. On the huge monitor behind him was the website for a new platform called NovaPath AI. It had all the usual signals: glossy gradients, polished truck images, sleek promises about intelligence, speed, and transformation. Ethan talked about it with obvious pride. He said this was the future, that it was cloud-native, AI-driven, capable of real-time optimization, and fully ready to replace the legacy system I had spent years keeping alive. The way he said legacy made it sound like he was describing a worn-out relic rather than the thing that kept the company functioning every single day. I asked the most basic question. First, what was the largest fleet size this platform had actually handled in the real world? Ethan scrolled through the company materials and gave me an answer that made my jaw nearly lock. Their biggest deployment had been only a few dozen vehicles. A few dozen. We were managing hundreds of trucks, multiple cargo classes, multiple states, and clients with highly specialized requirements. Comparing those realities was absurd. It was like testing a canoe in a pond and declaring it ready for the open ocean. But Ethan still talked as though the letters A and I erased every practical concern. Then I learned the platform was run by his friend, Nolan Pierce. That detail alone was enough to drain whatever benefit of the doubt I might have had. I am not against new technology because it is new. I am against reckless trust, placed in unproven systems, when the cost of failure will be paid by people who never agreed to be part of an experiment. Sitting there, listening to Ethan praise a platform that had not earned the right to touch our operation, I understood something grimly simple. This was no longer a conversation about improvement. It was a story about ego, and influence, and the dangerous habit of treating a complex business like a sandbox for personal alliances. I did not stop at the fleet size question, because I knew disasters in freight usually hide behind the questions amateurs never think to ask. I asked how NovaPath AI handled hazardous material routing. I asked about tunnel restrictions, bridge limits, state-by-state compliance differences, electronic logging device data, and hours of service enforcement. I asked the kind of questions that only sound excessive to people who have never had a shipment blow up in their face. Ethan's responses were worse than I expected. He did not answer with precision. He answered with assumptions. He said things like, "I'm sure it covers that, and they told me it's built for complex routing, and worst of all, the system will learn as it goes." I nearly laughed at the insanity of that phrase. In freight, there are things you do not get to learn through failure. You do not let an untested platform experiment its way through hazardous loads and federal rules while hoping the machine gets smarter before someone gets burned. You do not ask a company handling real cargo, real contracts, and real legal exposure to become a training ground for a product still proving itself. Every answer Ethan gave revealed the same truth. He was prepared to hand the company's nerve center to something he did not understand because he liked the story attached to it. What exhausted me most was knowing he had not brought me in to hear my judgment. He had brought me in because the script was already written. I was the old guard, the inconvenient expert, the person whose knowledge complicated the clean narrative he wanted to sell upward. By then, I was no longer wondering whether this would fail. I was already wondering how many innocent people would be crushed when it did. And the answer was never going to be Ethan or Nolan. It was going to be dispatchers, drivers, managers, customers, and everyone lower in the stack who would pay for the arrogance of people treating freight like a buzzword-friendly case study. The meeting with the soft corporate title about organizational realignment went exactly the way I knew it would. In the room were Ethan, the HR director Laura Bennett, and the man they introduced as my replacement in logistics technology, Mason Reed. One look at him told me he was new. And not just new in the healthy, teachable sense. He had the look of someone who did not yet understand the depth of the industry he was stepping into. They spoke in calm, professional tones, and used the usual language about transition, alignment, and future direction. But anyone who has spent enough time in business can translate that vocabulary instantly. They were firing me, and they wanted me to hand over more than a decade of institutional knowledge in a matter of days. I sat there listening to them request access credentials, documentation, process notes, and transition support. And I had to fight not to laugh at how absurd it was. They imagined a system grown through years of pressure could be compressed into folders and walkthroughs. They imagined judgment could be exported like a file. Mason barely looked fully present at moments, which only sharpened my sense that none of them understood the scale of the gamble they were making. Was I angry? Absolutely. But the stronger feeling was a bitter ache. I was not just being replaced. I was watching a network I had protected for years get handed to people who were not remotely ready. If you have ever seen someone pushed aside not because they failed, but because leadership wanted the optics of a reinvention story, subscribe to the channel right here. Because this was never only about losing a job. It was about what happens when performance theater is allowed to outrank real competence. And the people paying for it are the ones who never asked to be part of the show, even knowing they did not truly understand the value of what they were demanding. I spent the next 2 days documenting everything I reasonably could. I did not do it because I owed leadership some noble loyalty. I did it because too many innocent people would suffer if I walked away without trying. But the longer I worked, the more obvious the limits of documentation became. Some things can be written into process notes. Some things cannot. I could explain how to monitor truck status, how to verify location drift, how to re-establish a broken client connection, and how to validate routing logic when a warehouse system changed its behavior. What I could not do was package instinct into bullet points. I could not fully document the reality that one receiving supervisor at a major warehouse loved to mark loads late if drivers arrived during his lunch break, which meant those deliveries had to be timed around his habits rather than the clock on paper. I could not flatten into a memo the fact that one driver's medical exemption had changed terms after a renewal, and that the old outside logging system still reflected outdated limits, forcing a manual check every week. Those details did not come from manuals. They came from being there long enough to remember, caring enough not to overlook them, and understanding that a tiny operational fact can save an entire load. I tried to explain that gently, but I could see it sliding past them. What they wanted was enough material to say the transition had been completed. What I understood was that they were asking for the illusion of continuity, while removing the very person who knew where the dangerous gaps actually were. Sitting there, writing transfer notes, felt strangely like writing final instructions for a house someone had already decided to tear down. Even though they barely understood the structure holding it up, Mason shadowed me during those 2 handoff days. And it took less than one morning for me to realize my worst suspicion was true. His inexperience was not the kind that can be compensated for with curiosity and humility. It was deeper than that. It was foundational. At one point, he asked me about a term so basic to freight operations that I honestly thought I had misheard him. I turned and looked at him, waiting for the punchline that never came. He was serious. The question itself was enough to reveal how dangerously unprepared he was for the role he had just been handed. In that moment, what I felt was no longer simple irritation. It was a cold, unmistakable fear. Not for myself. I was already out of the equation. I was afraid for the drivers, for dispatch, for the clients, for every person about to depend on decisions made by people who treated expertise like a detail to be filled in later. I still answered him. I still explained. I still pointed out where the landmines were. But each basic question felt like another confirmation that this situation had gone far beyond bad judgment and into recklessness. Worse, Mason did not seem appropriately humbled by how much he did not know. He had that borrowed confidence people sometimes get from proximity to trendy technology. As if a clean interface and a few fashionable terms could compensate for missing bedrock knowledge. I had seen that kind before. People not yet skilled enough to understand the size of their own blind spots. They are often the most dangerous people in the room when the room contains systems capable of sending hundreds of trucks in the wrong direction with the click of a mouse. By the end of that second day, I was no longer holding on to hope that they might somehow pull this off. I was just waiting to find out how loudly it would explode. When the day came for me to leave, I packed up faster than I expected. My old coffee mug, a family photo, the truck-shaped stress ball my team had given me years earlier as a joke, and a few other objects that looked small, until I realized how heavy they felt in my hands. As I moved through dispatch, people shook my hand, hugged me, tried to joke their way through the tension, and failed to hide the worry in their eyes. That was the part that hurt most. Those people knew me not because I wrote code, but because I always showed up when things fell apart. They trusted that I would not vanish at the end of my shift while they were drowning. Maybe that is why the feelings inside me were so tangled. As I walked out, I was angry at being pushed aside by people who did not understand the value of the work. I was relieved not to sit there helplessly watching them dismantle something I had spent years protecting. But stronger than either was a numb, hollow sensation I have only ever felt when watching someone make a catastrophic mistake you already warned them about. It is a strange kind of helplessness, because part of you wants to stop it, and another part already knows they will only believe the danger after the crash. On the drive home, I kept the music low and let it fill the empty places in my head. I wondered whether I would miss the office, the routines, the systems, but almost immediately I knew the answer. I would miss the people, the ones who had stayed up through storms and equipment failures and customer emergencies with me, the ones who did real work without making speeches about it. That was what I was leaving behind. And even though I was technically free, I could not shake the feeling that the building I had just left was already stepping toward a nightmare none of them deserved. The nightmare arrived even faster than I expected. Not long after the new platform went live, my phone started lighting up with messages from people still inside dispatch. The first one described a sensitive load being routed onto an inappropriate path. A driver caught the issue and refused the instruction because he understood the operational and legal risk the system had completely missed. Then another message came in. Then another. It felt like watching brief clips from a slow-motion disaster. No one could stop once it had begun. I sat staring at the screen with that terrible tightening in my stomach that comes when confirmation arrives exactly the way you feared it would. I was not surprised. I was heartsick. Early-stage collapse is always the ugliest moment, because the people inside it still do not understand how wide the damage is going to spread. Soon the errors became a pattern. The new platform sent multiple refrigerated loads to the wrong destination point, leaving temperature-sensitive food waiting in a facility that was not equipped to handle it properly. It tried to optimize by reassigning drivers mid-route without correctly respecting legal work limits, effectively pushing exhausted people toward unlawful or impossible runs. And when drivers refused instructions that made no sense, the system treated them like non-compliant users and locked them out. Even hearing about it secondhand, I could picture the dispatch floor, clearly phones ringing nonstop, managers shouting, drivers furious, and the software calmly issuing one bad decision after another, like a machine too stupid to understand the damage it was causing. The worst part was never that I had been proven right. There is no satisfaction in watching innocent people get crushed by a prediction coming true. Every one of those errors landed on someone who had not chosen this experiment. Drivers were stranded. Dispatchers were overwhelmed. Customers were furious. And the people who had made the reckless decision were still nowhere near the deepest part of the pain. Within a very short time, those scattered failures hardened into full operational chaos. A major customer lost an enormous amount of product because trucks carrying frozen food were sent to the wrong facility and left waiting too long in conditions that should never have happened. Dozens of trailers sat in limbo. Drivers were stranded not because of weather or road closures, but because the dispatch platform itself had turned them into casualties of bad logic. Some were rerouted at the last second into trips that exceeded legal driving limits. Some were locked out for refusing unlawful instructions. Others sat at stops for hours without valid dispatch orders. Unable to move forward and unable to get meaningful help, a freight company can survive pressure. It can survive peak season. It can survive storms. What it struggles to survive is a central dispatch system making wrong decisions at scale. Once the heart of the operation starts sending bad commands, the rest of the body convulses with it. I kept hearing about trucks sitting idle, spoiled loads, and customer calls that had already shifted from irritation into threat. Large contracts come with brutal clauses. And anyone in the industry knows that one serious chain of failures can give a client every reason to walk away for good. I knew the company was entering the zone where losses stop being measured by one delayed run or one damaged shipment. They start being measured in trust. And trust in freight is brutally hard to restore once broken. When a customer begins asking whether they can still safely place part of their supply chain in your hands, the damage has already outgrown any short-term accounting spreadsheet. I sat at home hearing those updates and felt the weight of it settle into me. I had left the company. Yes, but I still knew exactly what a collapsing operation sounds like, even from a distance. It sounds like panic. Tout silence. Ringing phones. And people discovering too late that experience had been the only thing standing between order and expensive. Public failure. Then the crisis moved beyond ordinary operational failure and into something far more dangerous. It was no longer just about spoiled cargo, immobilized trucks, or angry customers. It began touching compliance and federal exposure. The new system had not only routed freight badly, it had also generated inaccurate electronic logging data, filling gaps with records that did not reflect reality. Maybe no person had set out to create fraudulent records, but that distinction matters less than people think once regulators are looking at the output. When logs suggest a driver exists in two places at nearly the same time, that is not the sort of thing authorities dismiss as a harmless software hiccup. It is exactly the kind of problem that triggers deeper questions about the integrity of the company's operations. I heard that federal investigators had opened a formal review, that the carrier's safety standing was being watched more closely, and that insurance representatives had started calling to ask about the migration. Only people who have lived through this understand how unsettling those insurance calls really are. They are not checking in to be helpful. They are assessing whether you have become a risk worth pricing higher or abandoning altogether. And for a freight company, being labeled unstable risk is like being slowly strangled. Sitting on my back porch with a cup of coffee, gone cold in my hand, I felt my mind run hot despite the morning stillness around me. I was not shocked. I was bitter. Because the exact chain I had feared was now unfolding in public view. They had not simply damaged an internal system, they had shaken the legal and compliance credibility of the entire company. And once a situation reaches that level, the cost is no longer controlled by the executives who smiled through my warnings and treated practical concerns like resistance to progress. Ethan Cole called me on a quiet morning at home, and I knew from the sound of his voice, before he even finished the first sentence, that he was no longer in control of anything. The man who used to speak like he owned the room now sounded ragged, hoarse, and frightened, as though a handful of days had aged him years. He did not waste much time. The company was spiraling. A major customer had pulled out. Another one was threatening to follow. Drivers had not been paid because the new platform was exporting broken payroll data. Fuel card integration had collapsed, leaving some drivers paying for diesel out of pocket just to avoid being stranded. Others were stuck at stops without valid dispatch orders. Federal pressure was building. Ethan tried to dress some of it in language about unforeseen issues. But I let him speak. I sat there quietly while he described disaster after disaster. And what I felt was not the hot anger I might have expected. It was a cold, exhausted clarity. Because everything he described had once lived inside the warnings I had already given. The compliance questions, the route restrictions, the payroll dependencies, the danger of replacing a proven system with one that had barely seen real scale. None of it was new. It was simply no longer theoretical. And then he finally said the part I had known was coming. He wanted me to come back. At least in a consulting capacity. To stabilize the situation. I did not answer immediately. In that pause, I thought about the drivers stranded on the road, the dispatchers drowning in calls, the people whose paychecks were hanging in limbo because executives had decided to gamble with critical infrastructure. I thought about the way I had been removed from the company I had helped hold together, and I understood something very clearly. If I walked back through those doors, it would not be to rescue anyone's pride. It would be because innocent people were paying the price. And if I returned, it would be on my terms alone. I gave Ethan my answer in a calm voice that surprised even me. If they wanted me back, there would be no appeals to loyalty, no sentimental rewriting of what had happened, and no vague promises. I demanded a substantial retainer wired before I stepped into the building. I demanded a new multi-year contract at double my former salary. More importantly, I required language giving me written approval power over any major system change going forward. I was not about to return just to become the cleanup crew for leaders who like to gamble with other people's livelihoods. If I was going to carry that burden again, I was going to have real authority to stop the next disaster before it started. I also told him Mason Reed had to be gone that same day. Harsh or not. That was no longer a personal judgment. I could not work alongside someone who lacked basic industry grounding and had already been allowed near the company's nervous system. I insisted on a written acknowledgement from leadership that this crisis had been caused by the deliberate decision to replace a functioning system with an untested platform. I wanted that truth documented, not because I needed emotional validation, but because the people who had dismissed operational knowledge needed to face the consequences in the language they respected most: formal accountability. There was a long silence on the line. I could imagine Ethan swallowing every word. He hated it. But he had lost the right to bargain from strength. When he finally agreed, it happened faster than I expected. After the call ended, he sat still for a minute. I did not feel triumphant. I felt sad, because none of this had been necessary. It did not have to cost so much for them to understand the value of experience. But sometimes people only agree to pay the real price of competence after the bill for arrogance becomes impossible to ignore. I returned the next morning before sunrise. The yard looked emptier than it should have. And just seeing that made something tighten painfully in my chest. Part of the fleet was still stranded, delayed, or trapped in the aftershocks of the previous days. Inside dispatch, the room looked like a battlefield after a long night, phones ringing nonstop. Whiteboards covered in handwritten route notes. Faces worn hollow by stress and lack of sleep. In the middle of all that, the NovaPath AI screens still glowed with their clean interface and cheerful status messaging. As if the software had no concept of the wreckage it had helped create. I did not waste a second on symbolism. The first thing I did was cut it off. I severed the integrations, revoked access, shut down every pathway that still allowed that platform to touch live operations. No one argued. At that point, everyone was too exhausted to defend a fantasy. The bitterly ironic part was that my old system was still there. It had not actually been dismantled, only neglected. Because the people who replaced me did not even know where to begin removing it. It had been left on the servers like something loyal waiting to be remembered. I brought it back online and watched service by service as the old framework woke up, reconnected, and started seeing the map clearly again. In that moment, I felt two things at once: pain and relief. Pain because all of this had been avoidable. Relief because there was still a foundation strong enough to pull the company back from the edge. That was the moment I stopped thinking about blame and went fully into recovery mode. I had done that kind of work too many times before. When things are on fire, speeches are useless. You cut power to the thing causing the damage. Restore the systems that tell the truth. And start putting the living pieces back where they belong. The hours that followed blurred into one long stretch of concentrated exhaustion. I sat down and worked as if every minute carried a price tag measured in contracts, paychecks, and trust. Because in truth, it did. I verified the real position of each truck, cross-checked it against clean data from the legacy system, and sorted through the polluted records left behind by the new platform. Then I began manually rebuilding the operating picture. Some runs had to be fully rerouted. Some drivers needed their legal working status verified from scratch because the previous logs had been contaminated by bad automation. I worked with payroll to correct the exported data and push emergency processing for the people who had been left unpaid. I restored the fuel card flow so no driver would have to keep covering diesel out of personal funds. I called the people who needed truth from someone who actually understood the situation, instead of another polished statement from management. One of the hardest parts was dealing directly with the federal investigator. I had to explain exactly what had happened, identify which records had been falsely generated by the third-party platform, show the clean historical compliance picture from my original system, and demonstrate that the source of the problem had been fully disconnected. Those conversations were not pleasant, but at least they were honest. Honesty was the one thing missing from the entire mess that had led us here. I barely remember how much coffee I drank or how many times I stood up from my desk. What I remember is the mental strain of holding thousands of details in focus, because any missed thread could pull the whole recovery apart again. When a company is standing at the edge of operational collapse, you do not get the luxury of being tired in a dramatic way. You stay functional until trucks start moving correctly, paychecks start landing where they belong, and the panic in people's voices finally begins to ease. Little by little, things started shifting back towards something recognizable as control. Not the fake kind of control executives like to describe in a memo, but the rough, practical kind that actually matters. Drivers began receiving valid dispatch instructions again. Fuel cards worked. Payroll corrected the backlog. And the people who had been left hanging finally got paid. Along with extra compensation for the disruption, federal regulators did not suddenly become friendly, but they stepped back from the most immediate and severe outcome. Another major client decided to stay after seeing that real operational stability had returned. But not everything could be saved. The biggest contract was already gone. I knew that before it was confirmed, because some losses carry a finality you can feel long before anyone says it aloud. There are forms of trust that do not come back just because you work hard for a few frantic days. I watched Ethan try to reach out, try to salvage something. But even I knew the odds were nearly non-existent. Some prices are paid not just for technical failure, but for choosing the wrong people to trust at the wrong moment. Still, when I looked around and saw dispatch breathing a little easier, when I heard that drivers who had been stranded now had real routes and real support again, some of the weight inside me lifted. I had not come back to rescue leadership's image. I had come back because the people below them needed someone to pull them back onto solid ground. And once that began happening, I finally allowed myself to feel something close to pride. Not pride that I had been right all along. There is nothing noble about being right when others suffer for it. I was proud that even after being treated unfairly, I had not let bitterness make me abandon the people who never deserved to pay for someone else's vanity. A few weeks later, the new order settled into place in the way it should have from the beginning. Ethan Cole was reassigned to another company in the investment firm's portfolio. Mason Reed disappeared from the picture as quickly as he had entered it. Nolan Pierce's startup lost credibility after the story spread through the industry. And I stepped back into my position with the authority that should have been attached to it all along. My new office did not need to be luxurious. A window overlooking the truck yard was enough. Every morning I watched the tractors start up, lights cutting through the early haze, each unit rolling out in the right sequence, on the right route, at the right time. Some people would call that steady operations. To me, it was proof of a simple truth. Far too many people forget behind every data point is a real life. No algorithm automatically knows that one warehouse supervisor always disappears for lunch at the same time, which means a truck has to arrive a little earlier. No simulation naturally understands the history and exception profile of each driver unless somebody cared enough to learn it and remember it. I do not hate technology. I hate arrogance disguised as innovation. Experience is not glamorous, but it is what keeps companies alive when everything catches fire. I set the truck-shaped stress ball on my desk and watched the fleet move through the gate, feeling the inside of me finally settle. In the end, the world keeps working, not because of slogans, but because of people who pay attention, remember what matters, take responsibility, and refuse to abandon a system when it needs defending most. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If it resonated with you, please leave one like and one subscription so you can stay with me for the next one.